So while he was here, Gary Witcher gave me lots of good ideas, lots of good suggestions and things like that. And I think one of the ones that has provided the most useful so far is always have a sermon ready, even if you're not prepared to, or even if you're not scheduled to preach. Jason texted me Friday and was like, "You're preaching Sunday night, right?" I'm like, I don't know. I can if you need me to. Can you turn the pulpit off? Thank you. And so I was like, yeah, I can get that done. I'll work on it and finish it Saturday. Well, then we ended up taking Evan to the ER yesterday because he was sick, and today he acts like there's nothing wrong. So I appreciate the prayers for him. But I'm going to give a lesson that I gave in Salina a couple months ago at a youth event, and we're going to be in the book of Nehemiah. A lot of times when I give a lesson, I kind of jump around and I connect different books and different chapters and things like that. But this time we're pretty much going to stay in the book of Nehemiah. They wanted me to talk to the group of teenagers that were there, just saying, what does it mean if somebody says, be a Nehemiah? Be a Nehemiah, be someone like Nehemiah, emulate them, be like them. So if you don't know much about Nehemiah, a little bit of his background is, as a worker, he was a layman. He was not a priest. He wasn't a prophet. He was just kind of your everyday worker. He did work in the king's court, and we'll get more to that here in a minute. But he was just kind of your average, everyday guy that worked a job, worked in the king's court, had responsibilities, and went about his life like that. But then he led a group of Jews to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the city walls. So we went from being this worker who had an important job, who had this job that he was good at and he was trusted, and he left that and went and led a group of Jews to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the city walls. Not only did he lead them, but he led them through opposition while people were harassing him and belittling him and trying to get him to stop. He still powered through it and continued on, leading them to rebuild the wall. He led the people to accomplish their goal. They set a goal, they knew what the action was that they had to do, and they completed that goal. But he also led by example. He didn't just say, pick up those bricks, build that wall. He helped them. He was a part of it. He gave up his position in the king's court for a position of hard labor. But most importantly of all, he gave God the credit for everything that happened, for all of the success. He never stopped giving God the credit. So let's start in chapter 1. Nehemiah chapter 1, starting in verse 3. He kind of hears some bad news here. It says, "Then they said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire." That sounds like pretty bad news for anybody to get. These people aren't doing too good, and the whole wall is gone. It's burned, it's broken down, its gates are burned with fire. That's just not really good news, but he responds, or we get his response in the next verse, verse 4. He says, "When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." So this news really hit him hard. He took it personally. He took that emotion inwardly and expressed it outwardly. Not only did it make him sad, but it made him really think about, what can I do? So what does he do? He says, "I sat down and wept and mourned for days." I've cried, probably never more than an hour, but thinking, just getting that mental image of weeping and mourning for days. This is something that is really close to him, something that means a lot to him. And so when he hears this bad news, that is his reaction to it. It continues, it says, "And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." In everything, he remembers to talk to God. He remembers to talk to God, to ask him for what he should do, for the guidance and the help in everything that he does. And we get that in verses 5 through 11. Nehemiah 1, 5 through 11. I said, I beseech you, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night, on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, If you are unlawful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote parts of the heavens, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servant your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. Now I was the cupbearer to the king. So this is a very, very emotional prayer, a very emotional plea that Nehemiah gives to God. He's giving God the glory, but he's also understanding the things that God had said that he would do. He said, the people, we have sinned against you. We are confessing the sins of the sons of Israel, which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. He's recognizing that he is not perfect. He is giving up that fact willingly, saying, we messed up. We need help. Please still listen to us. He continues all through verse 7, talking about how they sinned. But in verse 8, he remembers the words that God had spoken to them. He said, remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the people. So God gave them a warning, and yet all these things still happened. But he says in verse 9, but if you, continuing with the command here, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there and will bring them to the place where I have chosen to cause my name to dwell. So if they follow God, if they come back and don't act against God, God will bring them back together. So verse 11, he asks of God. He says, this is everything that we've done wrong. Please help us. He says, O Lord, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight to revere your name, and make your servant successful today, and grant him compassion before this man. So he's asking God for help. This is what we should be doing too. Whether something happens that causes us to weep and mourn for days, something doesn't go right, when things do go right, we need to pray to God, ask him to hear us, and ask him to be attentive to the prayer that we give him. And at the very last part there in verse 11, we finally learn the occupation of Nehemiah. He was the cupbearer to the king. We know that the cupbearer was someone who was a trusted person. This person was someone who was responsible for keeping the king safe and the things that he drank. And so this was a trusted position. So it may not have been one of leadership, but it was a trusted position. So that gives us a little more idea of the characteristics of Nehemiah. So chapter 2 starts out, says, and it came about in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wineglass and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. We're going to pause there. He had not been sad in his presence, indicating that he had been, or that he was sad. And the king noticed this in verse 2. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? There is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. So these things caused Nehemiah to be outwardly sad. It's not a bad thing to show your emotions. It's not a bad thing to express them. The world wants us to think that, well, if you cry, you're weak. That is not true. If you cry because you need to cry, and that's perfectly fine. I gave a sermon months ago about it's okay to cry because Jesus cried. And he was sad, and it was showing in the expression on his face. So a question I posed is, are we ever outwardly sad enough that our friends realize this and notice it and say something to us about it? Are we close enough with people that they can say, something's different, you look sad, tell me what's going on? So he was sad about all the things that had happened in chapter 1. He had just prayed to God. And then chapter 2, verse 5, he asks of the king. He says, I said to the king, if it please the king, and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah for the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So he is obviously, like we've said, pretty close to the king. He's the cupbearer, and he makes a request. Now, whether the king would give this request to just anybody, we don't know. But he's saying, let me leave my position here and go and do this. He asks the king to send him to Judah to rebuild. And then verse 8, the second half, and the king granted them to me because the good hand of my God was on me. So again, Nehemiah gave that glory, gave that honor to God for making this happen. Verses 11 through 16, he goes and inspects the walls of Jerusalem. So the king did send him, and it says, so I came to Jerusalem, and I was there 3 days. And I arose that night, I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting in my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well and on to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night to the ravine and inspected the wall, and I entered the valley gate again and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. So he goes and inspects the wall, and for lack of a better term, things are bad. Things don't look good. It's exactly as it had been reported to him, and he finally gets to see it for himself. So then in 17 and 18, he finally talks to the people who are with him and the people who will be helping him. He says, then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. So he tells them, this was my plan from the beginning. God has been with me. The king sent me. The king gave me his blessing. Let's get to work. So he mentions that he gives them the same report, exactly how it was given to him, that the walls were broken, the gates were on fire, they were burned down. Sorry, not on fire, they were burned down, and that God was favorable towards him in this situation. So verse 19, he just said, so they put their hands to the good work. But verse 19 is a really quick turnaround of what happens. So, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? So here we get our first glimpse of the mocking, of the insults happening towards them. But we know that Nehemiah doesn't stop. This doesn't stop Nehemiah. It doesn't hinder him. He doesn't say, oh, you're right, I don't want to deal with this, I'm going to go home. He stays there, and that's what he continues to do. Now, I really don't like to skip chapters in the Bible, but Nehemiah chapter 3 is a bunch of names that are hard to pronounce, and it gives the description or the names of all the people that helped rebuild certain parts of the wall and of the gate. So let's go on to chapter 4. First two verses of chapter 4. Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones? So he's starting right off the bat, again, mocking them and giving them a hard time. This isn't something that's being said in private. It's something that gets back to Nehemiah. Nehemiah hears the things that are happening. Verse 3 says, Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, Even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down. So even the work that they have done, they're mocking that work. They're saying if a fox jumped on it, it would fall down. So it's really hard to do work when somebody's mocking you, when somebody's making fun of you, when somebody's giving you a hard time. But that's exactly what's happening here. Verses 4 and 5, though, Nehemiah has the perfect response that we should emulate, the perfect response that we should take note of. First thing he does after this happens is he prays to God. He says, Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return the reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in the land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders. If you were saying that about or to anybody else but God, they might say you're being mean, might say that you're being a little judgmental. But these men are trying to prevent them from rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, hurling insults at them, trying to hinder them in what they're doing. So he just right out asks God, hey, we need some help. He says all these things, ask God to do all these things, return their reproach on their own heads, do not forgive their iniquities, and let not their sins be blotted out. But the key point there is he asks God for help. He asks God to help them through this, and we need to do the same when we run into adversity. When we run into adversity, our first thought should be talk to God. God has the answers. God knows what to do. We need to pray to God and talk to him and ask him for help. Jump down to verse 14. It says, Now when I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So they had talked to God, and because of this, they had gained courage. They had gained the ability not to be afraid, and it gave them the courage because of who God is and what he could do, and it should do the same for us. God helps us through anything and everything that comes to our lives, happens to us. We need to remember to pray to God, and he will help us through everything that we experience in life. Verse 21 points out makes an interesting point. Verse 21 says, So we carried on the work with half of them holding spears from dawn until the stars appeared. Why point this out? Even though they trusted in God, half of them held spears and half of them worked. Now, it doesn't say this specifically, but what I take from it is half of them worked and did not worry about retaliation, did not worry about danger, because they knew the other half of the people were holding spears. The other half were there protecting them. The other half were there and they had their back. And that says worlds for the trust that they had for each other. We need to find people that we can trust like that. We need to find people that have our back, that we can turn our back and be fully vulnerable because we know they've got us. We know through everything that God has our back, but we need to put ourselves around friends and acquaintances that we know will have our back. So skip to chapter 5, starting in verse 14. The chapter heading in my Bible is Nehemiah's example, and that's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time, is the example that Nehemiah gives us and that he gave to the people. But we'll read 14 through 19. Moreover, from the day that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year of the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, for 12 years neither I nor my kinsmen have eaten the governor's food allowance. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants domineered the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. I also applied myself to the work on this wall. We did not buy any land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. Moreover, they were at my table 150 Jews and officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. Now that which was prepared for each day was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also birds were prepared for me, and once in 10 days all sorts of wine were furnished in abundance. Yet for all of this I did not demand the governor's food allowance, because the servitude was heavy on the people. Remember me, O my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. So he led by example. This governor's allowance, he should have been able to eat and have the better things, been able to eat out of abundance, but he shared it with the people. All this food was prepared, but he was a part of his people. So he was appointed to be the governor of the land of Judah, but he did not burden the people. This not only gives us an example of what he did and what he didn't do, but it also kind of gives us a visualization of what had happened before then, that the people had been burdened enough for him to make a point to say that I did not burden the people. So this is probably a change for the people. This was a change and a good way for the people to not be burdened by Nehemiah. He also said there in verse 16, I also applied myself to the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. So he was there working with them. A good leader works with you, doesn't just command you, doesn't just direct you what to do. They are there right beside you, working hand in hand with you. So chapter 6, starting in 15, we get the good news. The wall is finished. They finished the wall here. We'll read 15 through 19. So the wall was completed on the 25th of the month of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard of it and all the nations surrounding us saw it, they lost their confidence, for they recognized that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Also in those days many letters went from the nobles of Judah to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ariah, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Moreover, they were speaking about his good deeds in my presence and reporting my words to him. Then Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. So the wall was completed in 52 days. This is the same wall that the people had mocked him, saying, there's no way that you can get this done. Even if you do, the wall is going to be so shaky, it's going to be so bad that if a fox jumps on it, it will fall over. But in 52 days, they completed the wall. And so when all of the people around heard of it, when they saw it, this wasn't something that was being done on the sidelines, something being done in quiet. This was kind of a big deal. The people all around heard it. They saw the wall. They saw that it was finished, and they lost their confidence. They thought that there was no way that this could be done, but when they saw that it was completed, they lost their confidence because all of the work had been completed. So Nehemiah had something to do. He knew what he wanted to do. He prayed to God, asking for his help with it, and they completed it 52 days after they started it. So I ask, so what? We have this great example of this man leading by example, this man that led these people to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, who prayed to God. What do we take from this? So Nehemiah, like I said, was a worker. He was someone who had a regular job. Let's call it a regular job. He didn't have leadership. He was in a trusted role, but he was someone that was working for the king. So God can use us no matter what our skills are, no matter what position we hold, no matter what job we hold, or even what people think of us. God can use us. God will use us no matter what. If we know that our faith in God will help us, we put our trust in God, anything can be accomplished. No matter what it is, there is no problem too small, there is no problem too big for us to bring to God. We need to talk to God, ask for his help, and put our trust in him, and anything can be accomplished. Now this next point is kind of hard to hear, it's kind of hard to say, and it's hard for us to say, I'm okay with that, but People aren't always going to like us. It's something that we learn from even a young age. People aren't always going to like us. That's okay. That's okay. People aren't going to like us. People may even try to hurt us physically or emotionally, but God will carry us through no matter what. When we put our faith in God, we can do anything. We know that God will get us through that. We know that the Bible says that God will be with us through everything and will carry us through if we put our faith and our trust in Him. But one of the most important points that I pulled from this story is that through everything, through the ridicule, through the sad news that he got, through the fasting, through the weeping, through the actual building, what did Nehemiah do through everything? He talked to God. He gave God the glory in everything. Even when the people were insulting them, he talked to God. When he heard the bad news, he talked to God. When the wall was done, he gave praise to God. We should do the same. We may not be out rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, but everything we are doing, we need to give that praise to God. Throughout the entire journey, Nehemiah gave praise to God. We're not doing all of these things on our own. There are so many things that we do that we think, oh, I did really good at that. Well, we couldn't have done it unless God made it possible. We couldn't have done it without God's help. God is the one guiding us and giving us the ability to do these things. So one final point, and it's really a big one, but it's really simple too. One person can have a life-changing impact on a nation, on a group of people, and anyone. One person can have that change. So, be that person. Be that person who has an impact. Be that person who can have a life-changing impact on a group of people, on people in McPherson, people in the world, people at work, people at school. Be that person. Make an impact. Don't just sit behind in the shadows, but make an impact. Stand out, make a change, but most importantly, trust in God. We always want to offer the invitation. We're always here for you, not just on Sundays and Wednesdays. We're here. You have our contact. If you ever need anything, we want you to ask us for help, ask us for prayers. We're always here for you. We love praying with people. We love praying for people and helping people, but we want to make this time available for those who would like to come if they need to make a public declaration, to ask for help publicly, to ask for prayers. If there's anything that we can do, please come while we stand and sing.